The thing about power is that most people misunderstand it. They think power is loud. They think it announces itself. They think the person in charge is always the one talking the most, moving the most noise. But real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that reshapes everything around it, is almost always quiet. And the person holding it rarely looks like they're holding anything at all. This is a story about a man who understood that better than anyone around him, a man who walked into rooms where others believed they had the upper hand, and he let them believe it, not because he was weak, not because he didn't see what was happening, but because he understood something most people never figure out, that the moment someone thinks they've already won, they stop paying attention, and that's when they're most vulnerable. His name doesn't matter for the purposes of what we're about to examine. What matters is the system he operated in, the people who underestimated him, and the series of decisions that turned what looked like a defeat into something no one saw coming. Not even the people closest to him. It started in the early 90s, in a mid-sized industrial city in the American Midwest. The kind of place where manufacturing had once been king, and was now slowly bleeding out. Factories were closing. Jobs were disappearing. And with that came the predictable chain reaction, rising poverty, fractured communities, and a political class scrambling to hold on to relevance in a town that was losing its reason to exist. In that environment, there was a particular sector of the local economy that still had juice. Real estate development. Not the glamorous kind. Not luxury condos or waterfront high-rises. This was about land, parcels of it, old factory lots, abandoned commercial buildings, residential blocks that had been neglected for decades. Whoever controlled the redevelopment pipeline controlled the future of the city. Everyone knew that. And the people who controlled it, at the time, were a tight circle of developers and political figures who had been running things for nearly 20 years. They had the contracts, they had the zoning influence, they had the relationships with state-level funding agencies. They weren't technically doing anything illegal, at least not anything provable, but they had built a system where every significant project flowed through their hands. If you wanted to build in that city, you went through them. If you didn't, your permits stalled, your inspections got delayed, your financing partners got nervous phone calls from people they trusted. That was the landscape. And into that landscape walked a man who, on paper, had no business being there. He wasn't from old money. He didn't come from a political family. He had no history in development. What he had was a small construction firm, about 14 employees, mostly doing subcontractor work for the very people who ran the system. Foundations, framing, basic structural work. He was, by every visible measure, a small player, a worker. Someone who showed up, did his piece of the job, collected his check, and went home. But here's what nobody noticed. While he was doing that work, he was learning, not just the trade, though he was good at that. He was learning the system itself. He was watching how contracts got awarded. He was listening to conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. He was tracking which parcels were being acquired, by whom, and at what price. He was doing this quietly, consistently, for years, not with any dramatic plan in mind, just with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge accumulated slowly becomes leverage. The first real shift happened in 1996. One of the major developers in the circle, a man named Gerald Fenton, had been working on a large redevelopment project near the old rail yard. It was supposed to be a mixed-use complex, retail on the ground floor, offices above, some residential. It was the kind of project that could anchor a whole neighborhood. Fenton had the political support. He had the preliminary approvals. What he didn't have was a reliable construction partner. His usual firm had overcommitted and was behind on 3 other projects. So Fenton reached out to the small firm, the one run by the man we're talking about. It was supposed to be a straightforward arrangement. Subcontract the structural work. keep the costs low, stay in your lane. But something happened during that project that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The small firm didn't just do the structural work. They did it faster, cleaner, and cheaper than anyone expected. They brought the framing in under budget. They solved a foundation issue that had been delaying the project for weeks, and they did it without drama, without complaints, without trying to renegotiate terms. Fenton noticed. More importantly, the city's building inspector noticed, and the planning commission noticed, and slowly, without anyone making a formal announcement, the small firm started getting mentioned in rooms where it hadn't been mentioned before. That should have been a threat to the existing circle, a new player getting attention. But it wasn't perceived that way. And the reason it wasn't perceived that way is the key to everything that happened next. The man running the small firm never acted like he was competing. He never challenged anyone publicly. He never bid against the established developers on major projects. He never went to city council meetings and made speeches. He did something far more effective. He made himself useful, indispensable even. Whenever one of the circle's projects hit a snag, his firm was available. Whenever a timeline was tight, he delivered. He became the person they called when things weren't working. And every time he helped, he asked for nothing in return. No equity stake, no partnership offer, no seat at the table. Just the contract fee, just the work. That's what made them comfortable. That's what made them stop watching him. But what they didn't see, and what wouldn't become visible for several more years, was what he was building underneath. While he was doing their work, he was also quietly acquiring options on land, not the prime parcels, not the ones everyone was fighting over. He was buying options on the overlooked pieces, the awkward lots, the parcels with environmental complications, the ones that sat between major development zones and had no obvious use. He did this through a series of small transactions, some in his own name, some through a modest LLC he'd set up. Nothing that would trigger attention, nothing that would show up on anyone's radar. Each purchase was small. Each one on its own meant nothing, but together they meant everything, because what he had quietly assembled over the course of about 4 years was a contiguous corridor of land that sat directly in the path of the city's next major infrastructure project, a connector road that would link the revitalized downtown area to a proposed regional transit hub. He didn't know about the transit hub when he started buying. Or maybe he did. That part was never entirely clear. What is clear is that by the time the transit hub was formally proposed in early 2001, he already controlled most of the land the road would need to cross. Now, here's where the psychology of the situation becomes critical. When the circle finally realized what had happened, their first instinct was not alarm. It was amusement. They genuinely believed they could handle it. After all, they had the political connections. They had the zoning authority. They could simply reroute the road. They could condemn the land through eminent domain. They could pressure the man into selling at a price they dictated. They had options, or at least, they thought they did. What they didn't understand was that the man had spent years building something they hadn't accounted for: relationships. Not with politicians, not with power brokers, with the people who actually lived in the neighborhoods affected by the development. He had hired locally. He had used his construction firm to do pro bono repair work on community buildings. He had shown up at neighborhood association meetings, not as a developer but as a contractor who cared about the area. So when the circle tried to use political pressure to force a reroute or a condemnation, they ran into something unexpected. Community opposition, not organized by the man himself, at least not visibly, but rooted in the trust he had built over years of quiet, consistent presence. The city council members who might have supported a forced acquisition suddenly found themselves facing constituents who asked uncomfortable questions. Why are you taking land from someone who's been helping this neighborhood? Why are you rerouting a road to benefit developers who've never set foot here? That was the first crack, and the people in the circle didn't handle it well. Fenton, who by this point was the most vocal member of the group, made the mistake of going public with his frustration. He gave an interview to the local paper in which he essentially accused the man of being a speculator who was holding the city hostage. It was a strategic error of the highest order, because the man wasn't a faceless corporation. He was a local contractor with 14 employees and a reputation for honest work. The narrative didn't stick. In fact, it backfired. It made Fenton look like a bully, and the man look like a David standing up to Goliath. That's where things began to change in a way that couldn't be reversed. The man, for the first time, made a public move. He didn't do it with aggression. He did it with an offer. He proposed a development plan for his corridor of land that included affordable housing, community retail space, and a public park. He presented it not as a counter-move, but as a vision, a contribution to the city's future. And he presented it directly to the Planning Commission, bypassing the circle entirely. The commission, which had been largely controlled by the established interests, found itself in an awkward position. The proposal was good. It was well designed. It addressed needs the city had been ignoring for years, and it came with the implicit backing of the neighborhoods that would be most affected. Rejecting it would have been politically damaging. Accepting it would mean acknowledging that someone outside the circle had outmaneuvered everyone inside it. They chose a middle path, which is what committees usually do when they're cornered. They tabled the proposal for further review, but that delay, which was supposed to buy the circle time to regroup, actually worked in the man's favor, because while the proposal sat in committee, public interest grew, local media covered it, neighborhood groups endorsed it. A few city council members, sensing which way the wind was blowing, quietly signaled their support, and the man waited. He didn't push, he didn't lobby, he didn't make phone calls or hold press conferences. He just waited, because he understood something that impatient people never grasp, that when you've created a situation where time works in your favor, the worst thing you can do is rush. 6 months passed. During that time, 2 things happened that accelerated the collapse of the circle's position. First, a state audit revealed irregularities in how several of Fenton's previous projects had been financed. Nothing criminal was proven, but the audit created a cloud of suspicion that made political allies nervous. Second, a competing regional developer from outside the city began expressing interest in the transit hub project, which meant the circle's monopoly on development wasn't just being challenged from below, it was being challenged from outside. Suddenly, the established players were fighting on 2 fronts, and the man with the small construction firm in the corridor of overlooked land was no longer the biggest threat in the room. He was, paradoxically, starting to look like a potential ally, because his project, if approved, would demonstrate that local developers could handle major initiatives. It would be an argument against bringing in outsiders. The irony was almost too perfect. The people who had dismissed him, who had laughed at his land purchases, who had tried to politically steamroll him, now needed him to succeed in order to protect their own relevance. But the man didn't rush to capitalize on that either. He didn't gloat. He didn't renegotiate from a position of obvious strength. He did something far more sophisticated. He let them come to him, and they did. Fenton himself made the call. It was a short conversation by most accounts. The terms were simple. The man's development plan would move forward with the circle's public support. In exchange, he would subcontract portions of the construction work to firms associated with the circle's members, giving them a financial stake in the project's success. It looked like a compromise. It looked like everyone was winning. But the structural reality was entirely different. The man now controlled the project. He set the terms. He managed the timeline. The circle's members were, for the first time, working for someone else, working for him. And here's what made it irreversible. The project succeeded. Not in a dramatic headline-grabbing way. It succeeded in the slow, grinding way that real development works. Permits were approved, construction began, units were built, tenants moved in. The community park opened. The connector road, which had been the original catalyst for the conflict, was built through his land with an easement that he controlled. Within 3 years, the man's firm had grown from 14 employees to over 60. He had a seat on the planning commission. He was being consulted on projects across the region, and the old circle, while not destroyed, had been fundamentally restructured. They were still in business, they still had projects, but they were no longer the gatekeepers. The system they had built, the one where everything flowed through them, had been quietly dismantled. The most remarkable thing about the entire sequence is that there was no single moment of confrontation, no dramatic showdown, no public humiliation. The man never raised his voice, he never made threats, he never exposed anyone or sought revenge. He simply built an alternative structure that made the old one obsolete, and he did it while letting the people in power believe, at every stage, that they were the ones making the decisions. There's a concept in game theory called the dominant strategy. It's the move that gives you the best outcome regardless of what your opponent does. Most people think dominant strategies are aggressive. They think it's about making the boldest move, the fastest move, the most forceful move. But in complex systems with multiple players and long-time horizons, the dominant strategy is almost always patience. It's almost always about positioning rather than attacking. The man understood that. Whether he learned it from experience, from observation, or from some innate sense of how systems work, he understood that you don't beat an entrenched power structure by confronting it head-on. You beat it by making yourself essential to it, by building quietly around it, and by waiting for it to create its own weaknesses. There's another element to this that often gets overlooked. The emotional discipline required to execute a strategy like this is extraordinary. Think about what it means to spend years being underestimated, years being treated as a small player, years watching people who are less competent than you enjoy more success simply because they were born into the right network. Most people in that situation would either give up or lash out. Both of those responses are natural, both are understandable, and both would have been fatal to the outcome he achieved. Instead, he channeled that energy into observation and preparation. He turned his disadvantage, being invisible, into his greatest asset. Because when you're invisible, people don't guard themselves around you. They talk freely. They reveal their plans. They show you the seams in their armor. And if you're paying attention, if you're patient enough to catalog those seams without acting on them prematurely, you accumulate a kind of strategic advantage that no amount of money or connections can match. The aftermath of the project's completion was quiet, in keeping with everything that preceded it. The man didn't give victory speeches. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't become a public figure. He continued working. He continued showing up in the same understated way he always had. But the landscape had changed. New developers entering the city no longer went to the old circle first. They went to him, not because he demanded it, not because he had political leverage, but because he had demonstrated something that is rare in any industry, and especially rare in development. He had shown that he could build something real, from nothing, in a hostile environment, without cutting corners or burning bridges. The people who had been in the circle adapted in different ways. Some accepted the new reality and worked within it. A few retired. Fenton moved to another state and started over. There was no dramatic reckoning, no trial, no expose. Just a gradual, almost organic restructuring of who held influence and how it was exercised. And that, perhaps, is the most important observation in this entire story. Real shifts in power don't look like what we expect them to look like. They don't come with fanfare. They don't come with confrontation. They come slowly, quietly, and they're usually only visible in retrospect. The people who lost power in this story didn't lose it in a single moment. They lost it in 1,000 small moments they never noticed. Every time they dismissed the man as a small player, every time they shared information in front of him because they didn't think he mattered, every time they assumed their position was secure because it had always been secure, those were the moments where the transfer happened. Invisible, gradual, irreversible. There's a temptation when you hear a story like this to draw simple lessons from it. Be patient, play the long game, stay quiet. And those lessons aren't wrong exactly, but they're incomplete. Because the man's success wasn't just about patience, it was about perception. He had an ability to see the system as it actually was, not as it presented itself. He could look at a circle of powerful developers and see not their strength, but their dependency on a structure that was already weakening. He could look at a corridor of overlooked land and see not what it was, but what it would become. That kind of vision isn't common, and it can't be reduced to a set of tactics. It's a way of seeing the world that combines patience with perception, discipline with flexibility, and ambition with restraint. It's rare, and when it appears, it tends to change everything around it, usually before anyone realizes what's happening. The city, as of the last credible accounts, continues to develop. The transit hub was built. The connector road carries traffic through land that was once considered worthless. The affordable housing units are occupied. The park is used. The neighborhood, which had been in decline for decades, shows signs of stabilization. None of it happened the way anyone predicted. None of it followed the script that the powerful had written. And the man who made it happen did so not by fighting the script, but by writing a different one entirely, one that the existing players couldn't see because they were too busy reading their own. That's the thing about letting people think they're winning. It requires you to hold two realities in your mind at the same time. The reality they see, where they're in control and you're irrelevant, and the reality you're building, where their control is an illusion and your irrelevance is a disguise. Most people can't do that. Most people need the world to reflect their strength back to them in real time. They need acknowledgement. They need visible progress. They need to feel like they're winning while they're winning. But sometimes the most powerful position you can occupy is the one where no one thinks you're a threat, where no one watches your moves, where no one bothers to ask what you're doing or why, because by the time they do ask, the answer is already obvious, and it's already too late.